This is the Drug and Disorder podcast series that addresses illicit economies and peace processes. I am Astrid Jamar, part of the Drugs and Disorder Consortium and based in London. I'll be hosting those podcast series from my living room in Scotland, Edinburgh. Through the different episodes, I'm inviting my colleagues to share their expertise based on their long experience researching borderlands in Afghanistan, Colombia and Myanmar. Today, I'm very glad to invite my colleagues from Myanmar. So first, let me introduce you Seng Lawn, who is the Executive Director of the Kachinland Research Centre, PRC, and also part of the Drugs and Disorder Consortium. So welcome, Seng Lawn.
Thank you, Astrid.
Then let me introduce Sai Aung Hla, who is the board member of the Shan Herald Agency News, Shan, and also part of the Drug and Disorder Consortium.
Thank you, Astrid.
And then finally, we are being joined as well by Patrick Meehan, who is a postdoctoral fellow at SOAS and the co-investigator of our project, Drugs and Disorder.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining. It is my pleasure today to host you on the podcast series and to hear from all your very long experience and research on Myanmar borderlands. So I'll invite Pat to give us a bit of an introduction of the history of the conflict and where we are today and what their research is kind of highlighting in those issues. Thank you, Pat.
Hi. So our work on the GCRF project in Myanmar focuses on two states, Kachin State and Shan State, which are in the country's borderland regions with China, India and Thailand. Like much of Myanmar's borderlands, these are areas that have experienced decades of armed conflict, in which there are multiple armed actors, including the Myanmar army, known as the Tatmadaw, and multiple ethnic armed organizations, often called as EAOs, and a large number of army-sanctioned militias. Decades of armed conflict, dating back in some areas to the 1940s and 50s, have created complex, fragmented, and highly militarized dynamics across these borderland regions. So armed conflict in the regions that we're studying has been driven by long-standing grievances against attempts by successive post-colonial governments to centralize power across the country's ethnically diverse borderlands, and to impose a racialized national ideology that entrenches the dominance of the country's ethnic majority Bamar population. And I think it's important to emphasize that many of these regions were never under the firm control of the central government through the country's history, that colonialism created a state with firm borders, and yet the territory that was included within that has never been part of a single nation state entity. The armed conflict has also been underpinned by localized tensions between armed organizations, shaped by ethnic and ideological divisions and competition for control over territory, population, resources, and trade routes. In 2010, after decades of authoritarian military rule, Myanmar held its first election since 1990. The main opposition party, the National League for Democracy, boycotted the election, although the quasi-civilian government that then came to power announced a range of political and economic reforms. And in August 2011, it announced the launching of a formal peace process, which it claimed was to secure lasting peace. And this marked the first official nationwide peace overture since 1963. There are around 20 different ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar today of varying size and territorial reach, and with different relations to the government. Some had long-standing ceasefires dating back to the 1980s, some had never had ceasefires, and some, like the Kachin Independence Army, had had ceasefires, but they broke down very early on into this peace process. The primary focus of the peace process came to be trying to reach a nationwide ceasefire agreement. And although a number of the EAOs did eventually sign this in 2015, the majority of these groups, except for two, were small, and the NCA never really became successful, although it was meant to provide a platform for further political dialogue and the signing of a political accord. This never really materialized. And by 2017, the peace process in many ways had stalled. It had entered a phase of crises, deadlock, and setbacks. And although there were hopes that the new democratic government under Aung San Suu Kyi that won another landslide of victory in 2020 might be able to reinvigorate the peace process, this has been dashed by the military coup that took place on the 1st of February 2021. And I think it's important to emphasize that in today's podcast, as we're reflecting on the peace process that was launched formally after 2011, the whole context in Myanmar has been radically transformed by the coup that took place in February. That there is renewed there's been brutal violence deployed by the military to try to stamp out the widespread opposition across the country. And the coup has also exacerbated long-standing tensions around the ongoing armed conflict in many parts of the country. So the peace process that in many ways was already failing now is extremely, well, non-existent in many ways since the coup. And the coup has unleashed sort of widespread revolutionary movements that are now intent upon trying to end the military's role in politics and to try and enact a more transformative change within the country. In terms of our own work on the GCRF project, it's been motivated by a concern to try to better understand and respond to the drug issues that are facing marginalized borderland communities. That Shan State and Kachin State, which are the areas that we focus on, have long been the epicenter of Southeast Asia's illegal drug production, both opium, which is converted into heroin, and methamphetamines. And although these areas are primarily seen as areas of drug production, they've become areas of rising levels of drug use and drug-related harm since the 1990s, especially linked to injecting heroin use. And the proliferation of worsening drug issues has been a major concern of borderland communities since the 1990s. And I think one of the key concerns that we're trying to get across in this project is that although drug-related harms have become a huge concern for borderland populations, there was very limited space within the formal peace process to address these.
Great, thank you, Pat. This was such a concise and rich explanation of such a long history. So let me just jump into the first question and invite Dan San Long to answer it. So the question being, what are some of the power dynamics between negotiating parties, and how have those affected the approach to illicit economies within the formal peace process?
Yes, talking about the power dynamic in the peace negotiation process, I think the main problem is the problem of inclusivity, because the major peace negotiation platform is called nationwide ceasefire process. I think the military government recognized officially, I think, 156 or so armed, organizations in Myanmar, but that probably may not include the militias and the other, armed groups. Those are some of the major armed groups that they recognize, 156 around, that. But in the formal peace process, it's only include 10 ethnic armed organizations. So by definition, it is not an inclusive process. Therefore, I think many actors, especially from the borderland areas, are left out in the peace process. So that's one of the problem of asymmetric power dynamic, within the formal peace negotiation process. That needs to address, when we think about how do we best, address the problem of illicit economies in illicit, drug trade in Myanmar, because you name it, the problem of drug production, the problem of drug abuses, these things all mainly take place in the borderland areas of Myanmar, but you are not including in the formal negotiation table those major, actors, in the negotiation table. So that's one of the major problem of the current peace negotiation process in Myanmar.
And like Dan Seng Lawn had just mentioned, just pointed out that yeah, it is not inclusive enough. That many key players are excluded from the negotiations. And another main point is it has been a long mistrust with the central government, and that's also like participating in on the current peace process is a question still then whether it will be ended as it had been for the last 20 years. Yeah, I would say there will be a long kind of peace process to be discussed and to kind of foresee for in Myanmar. Yeah,
thank you. But do you want to add something, or shall we jump to the next question?
I think I was just going to say it's important to remember as well that the launching of the formal peace process came after the military had enshrined the 2008 constitution, which very much entrenched its power over the political system. And in the run-up to the formal peace process, it had also put huge pressure on a number of these ethnic armed organizations to convert themselves into border guard forces, which were organizations that were going to have less political autonomy and were going to come under the increasing control of the military. So what you saw was the launching of the formal peace process came at the end of a process in which the military had already been trying to assert much firmer control over the political system. And I think in many ways, from the military's perspective, the peace process was a way of trying to enforce compliance along its own sort of political agenda rather than entering into meaningful and genuine political dialogue. So right from the beginning, you had these very uneven kind of power relations that were set in place for the rest of the peace process.
So this brings us to the next question on being, are there any neglected challenges relating to illicit economies within the formal peace process? And how are those unaddressed issues affecting the implementation of policy responses to drugs adopted through the peace process? So I'll invite Sai Aung Hla to respond to this. Thank you.
Thank you. If we look at like this current peace process and an issue related to these illicit economies, especially like these drug issues, it has never been, or very little, bringing on the table for the discussion. And so we can say like drugs has never been a main, issues, on this current peace process. So we have seen, very little, progress or response to these issues, especially, looking at on the borderland areas where the drugs has been, embedded in the everyday life of the population in this area. But initiative to address this issue has been, problematic, and the key holder, as I mentioned, the military, try to approach, to the ethnic groups in very specific areas, but those policies has only been on the written paper, but in practical it has never been it has not been a success.
Thank you.
Yes, I might add a little bit on it. I think in the major text about the peace negotiation process is called Nationwide Ceasefire Agreement, NCA. Under that, I think there is the passing remark on the drug issues under the social affairs, chapter, but not really addressing the ground situation there. For instance, there are the communities, run, you know, drug prevention activities going on since 2013, 14, you know, things like that. I think the way we approach the illicit drug problems in the community levels is not really, I mean, it hasn't really come up to the important, you know, negotiation table yet. Yes.
Then, do you want to jump in, Pat, or?
Yeah, I think it's just to reiterate the point that the peace process has created almost no space to engage with drug economies at all. And again, that reflects the disconnect between the concerns that populations have around worsening drug-related harms in many conflict-affected spaces and the inability of the formal peace process to try to address some of these issues. And I think in part that was also tied up with the fact that for a long time, drug issues have always been part of a blame game that, you know, the military has often tried to blame ethnic armed organizations for the drug trade. And likewise, many armed organizations have also emphasized how drug issues are embedded in the way that the military operates in these areas. So from what was already a very complex, fragmented and quite weak peace process, I think addressing an issue like drugs, which is highly sensitive and highly politicized, in which there are clear links between the drug trade and authorities in these regions, has created a reluctance to tackle these issues, I guess around a concern that it would destabilize what was already a very weak kind of process. But at the same time, that then creates a huge gap in how do you actually try to address some of these concerns that are having a big impact on everyday lives in these areas.
Yeah, this is a great point to bring to the next topic. So based on the different dimension of the conversation that we had so far, Dan Seng Lawn, could you give us a bit of insights of what opportunities, challenges, and changes are resulting from the peace process for borderlands communities?
Yeah, I think in some borderland communities, I think you know, entering into the ceasefire negotiation that might provide them a space, you know, a safer space, let's say, for a limited time period, because at least there will be like a ceasing of, you know, armed clashes in some areas that might provide an opportunity for the local communities to travel safely, and then to conduct the social functions, and, you know, meets the relative from different, you know, places and things like that. So I think that's one of the major benefit. Other than that, not much, because in terms of the illicit drug problems in Myanmar, it's hasn't really, you know, reduced, you know, whether you enter into the peace process or not, you know, the problems remain the same. And with the recent, you know, coup d'etat, you know, orchestrated by the military, I think the situations are now even worse now, because I think you have the general problem of the breakdown of rule of law, you know, that's in a way create a good opportunity for the drug dealers to, for selling drugs and things like that. And then you also have the same problem of drug abuse problems. And talking about the Kachin experience, I think it has been a long time that we haven't seen heroin, user injecting drug in the broad daylight since 2014. We haven't seen that kind of scene for a long time, but now I think we started seeing again after the coup d'etat. So I think yeah, talking about the things are now breaking down in a way, in Myanmar after the military coup. So I think, yeah, my colleagues can also provide more information on that as well.
All right. Yeah, if I may to add to the challenges with the peace process that I mean, looking in the past for 20 years, and how the borderland populations had been facing, I think like the gap between like the rich and poor has been widened, and yeah, we also like this borderland has also like been facing on the ongoing conflict. This is yeah, the ideas of like the peace process that initiated by the Dharmator is meant to for the annexed marginalized people is seen as like the divided and rule, and which they trying to give power to one group but attack to the other groups. And with this uneven contribution to this area, that also like create another form of violence, and also like the yeah, unresolved this conflict will continue. And also like the drug has been used as the military yeah, political economies, and which also like attached or embedded in every regions, socials and region lines. And we can see addressing or trying to address the peace process by the military solution will lead to another decades of conflict and also like poverty in Myanmar. Yeah.
I guess maybe just a final point around that is the disconnect between the fact that at the center of the political system in Myanmar, you had a lot of narrative around peace building and the formal peace process being launched, and an emerging sort of infrastructure of donor support and NGOs working around peace issues. And at the same time, in Northern Shan State and Kachin State, you couldn't even talk about the peace process because this was a period where you'd had much worsening armed conflict that really coincided with the beginning of the formal peace process. So you had a big disconnect between the narratives around peace building at the same time that in many ways these were kind of hot conflicts, and you were trying to do peace building amidst worsening levels of armed conflict.
Yeah, great, thank you, Pat. So finally, the final questions of the podcast is kind of trying to understand how those different developments and how the previous development and counter narcotic politics shaped how peace is envisioned or articulated within the peace process. So Pat, could you give us some insight on this?
Yeah, I think one of the big themes in the work that we've been doing on the GCRF project is trying to reflect more on previous ceasefire periods that predated the formal peace process. So it were agreed between the military government and various ethnic armed organizations that dated back to the late 1980s or early 1990s. So in Kachin State and parts of Northern Shan State that had long been a sort of crucible of armed conflict in Myanmar, you actually saw through the 1990s and the 2000s a reduction in levels of armed conflict because you had these fragile ceasefires that were in place. But I think, so what we've been trying to do in this project is try to reflect a little bit more on the legacy of that previous ceasefire period and how that has then shaped drug issues and the formal peace process that was launched since 2011. And I think one of the key points we're trying to emphasize through that is that although the ceasefires were welcomed in the sense that they did reduce levels of overt violence and armed conflict, they were also associated with new types of violence, and new ceasefires were accompanied by a sustained process of militarization by the Myanmar army in contested areas. You also had much greater inflows of investment into these areas that then became associated with problematic forms of resource extraction that led to large amounts of environmental degradation, worsening levels of insecurity in many areas because they also became accompanied with forms of militarization. And it was also through this period that you saw the sort of slow violence emerging of drug addiction and drug harms. Like Seng Lawn and the KRC team have looked at this a lot in relation to the mining sector in Kachin state, where although that had always been a part, like drug issues had always been a part of some of the kind of the challenges, say, around the bigger jade mines, this became an issue that became much more widespread right across Kachin state. And you almost had a sort of paradox under the previous ceasefire arrangements, that on the one hand, the very ceasefire agreements that helped to reduce levels of armed conflict actually paved the way for these new forms of violence and instability in the forms of damaging forms of development, militarization, and drug issues. And I think this is another point to get across that we've been trying to make in the project, that when the formal peace process was launched in 2011, and when you had some of the sanctions ending and you had this rush for external actors to engage, a lot of the narrative around that was all about peace and development. But these were the same kinds of narratives that borderland populations have been hearing through the 90s and 2000s, and by that time had come to sound very hollow, because it was very much associated actually with greater forms of livelihood insecurity, greater forms of instability and insecurity. And I think that underpins a lot of the kind of the concerns and some of the skepticism around the peace process as it was launched, that it was these memories of previous kind of development schemes and the worsening drug issues around that. And I don't know if you two want to come in, maybe first on Seng Lawn, reflecting a little bit more around especially the KIA ceasefire experience.
Yes, I think the development, you know, especially the focusing on the physical development policies, I think the KIA ceasefire process from 1995 to 2010, the 17 years long ceasefire periods, you know, can possibly give us a lesson on that. You know, the based on the you know, the physical, you know, development, focusing on the physical development and the infrastructure development and things like that, I think that may not lead to a sustainable peace, you know, in the conflict, you know, a protracted conflict setting in a country like Myanmar, because I think whatever you have built up during this ceasefire period, I think, let's say in the Kachin case, 17 years long ceasefire period, I think everything comes to, you know, to zero level, you know, again, you know, when a new conflict cycle broke out again, you know. That way, I think you have to restart everything again and things like that, and then, you know, it won't lead anywhere. So that's one of the lessons that we have to learn from Kachin's ceasefire experience, I think, because as Saila indicated a little bit about the gap between the social gap between the social and income gap between the communities, that's, I think, one of the, because in the Kachin experience, I think it's the ceasefire period, I think it's favored the men with authorities. I think men with capital, you know, they can benefit, but the grassroots communities, they found themselves after the ceasefire period, after they found themselves, they lost their land, you know, and then their children become drug addicts and things like that. So yeah, And the other thing is about the counter-narcotic policies. I think the Tamils normally used to force their way, you know, for instance, the one of the major ethnic armed groups in Kachin State, the new Kachin Democratic Army, you know, they have to they were forced to transform into border guard force in 2008 because some of their activities are, you know, includes the, you know, drug business and things like that. I think it's the Tamil can use it very nicely to force, you know, them to change into border guard force, you know, using the counter-narcotic policies. Yeah.
Thank you. One thing that kind of, I think, thank you both for giving me such a interesting and critical review of all this peace and ceasefire positivistic language, which, as you've described very clearly, how it brings very problematic and very critical new forms of violence and destructive form of violence of development. So I was wondering, though, like, if you, from the research from the in the borderlands, is there any specific demands that are being formulated, even if they're not being taken on board by the formal process? And like, if this peace doesn't work, what borderlands population want to see as peace for themselves?
I think probably the borderlands communities, I think they want to be safe in the first place, and that's their primary, you know, demand, you know, because you can't go on lives that way for generations, you know, living in a not in a safe environment, you know. You cannot travel from village to village. You cannot visit to your relatives. You cannot go safely to your farm, to your farms, and things like that. I think that's one of the major, you know, needs for them. I think this safety, you know, should be the first thing for them, and then it will follow the development, not just physical development. I think the, you know, education, you know, health, you know, all these kind of developments are more important for them rather than building the road and, you know, things like that. I think because that normally do not favor the grassroots communities. It's only favor the men with authorities and then, you know, men with capital.
Thank you. Sai, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, if talking about like the drug issue, I think it's like the drug addict or like the harmful drugs has been a very, you know, big issues among like the population in Shan State. And it's the program has been, you know, bigger and bigger, you know, from year to year. I think with this, it will also like ruins, you know, this population, these young people in this area. I would say they need this issue to be addressed.
Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap up the conversation. I don't know if Pat wants to add a final point.
No, just to say thank you. It's been really interesting to hear more from Sai Aung Hla and Seng Lawn and to have a chance to have this conversation.
Well, thank you, the three of you, to taking the time in your very busy schedule to share all the very important work you are doing that is particularly important within the context and the difficulties that Myanmar are facing today. So thank you for this, and I hope to continue the conversation beyond the podcast. And for the listeners, just please stay tuned for the next episode on Afghanistan, and then a more cross-country conversation in the rest of the podcast series. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.